and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us in this latest episode of CHACR Take Away video interviews with a leading expert on a topic of concern or question for British defense. And today we are discussing China, or rather the question of China that has been asked in defense circles within the transatlantic alliance for a few years now. But with the COVID-19, these conversations have taken a different tone. Some of that relates to our understanding of the direction of global politics and the polarizations in the world and how different states see themselves and their roles in international affairs. But some of that boils down to very nitty-gritty security and defense challenges over the question of Chinese policies in the South China Sea, as well as questions around counterintelligence, integrity of our information, and international institutions, and etc. And so we are thrilled to have today somebody who can help us to explore both the questions that emerges from China's renewed presence in global affairs, but also what that might mean for British defense and security. Dr. Raffaello Pantucci is not a stranger to many of you. He was directing Russia's international security program, and before he moved to Singapore a while ago, where he is now a senior fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and he's also still a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. I just upgraded the institute's name to economy. And he's been covering China and Chinese activities and policies in Central Asia, as well as questions on security and counterterrorism for many years. Raffaello, thank you so much for joining us all the way from Singapore. I suppose the first question that I have in mind is the question of China, or rather implications of China's newly found regional and international assertions, have been going on for a while. You and I have partaken in some of these conversations before, asked the question of what does that mean for regional stability, but also integrity of international organizations, and understanding of how some of these relationships play. Particularly in Washington, D.C., we have seen over the years increasing nonpartisan attention and concern over China. And a lot of similar discussions in Europe didn't really yield that united kind of understanding, but this has been going on for a while. And it seems like the COVID-19 era has really accelerated some of these questions and really brought the China question to the forefront of a lot of conversations in defense and security. In what way do you think what we are looking at now, or the topics that we're discussing about China, is reflecting of this new era? Is this just because of COVID-19, or are things really reaching to that breaking point where European countries as well as US have to do some serious thinking and application on their defense and security posture vis-a-vis the questions of China?
Well, first, thank you, Ziya and CHACR, for the kind invitation to join you. It's a great pleasure to come and talk to you about China again. I've enjoyed our previous engagements that we've done this. I think the question you ask about really COVID and the impact it's had on the kind of China relationship with the West, or the world in general, is an interesting one, because it's a question that on the one hand, it is very clear that during this period of COVID, things have sharpened with China's relationship with the world. And in part, that's linked to obvious things like the fact that the virus first emanated from China. And the Chinese government's been somewhat, has denied that fact, even though it seems abundantly clear that that is what actually happened. They've sort of muddied the waters in a very confusing way. And they've done this on top of a sort of attempt towards medical diplomacy, trying to win friends under that in a very sort of aggressive and coercive way. All of which means that actually, if you look at the kind of relationship of China with the West, you can certainly look at COVID and see that this is a moment at which things got a lot worse. But I think the key thing to realize is that it got a lot worse for a lot of different reasons, and things were already on a pretty negative trajectory beforehand. One of the first things, which I think is often overlooked, is the fact that China has become a much more aggressive power over the past few years. And there's a debate to be had, and depending on which capital you're sitting in, you'll ascribe to one side or the other, of whether this is due to American change or Chinese change. I would argue it's probably more to do with China, frankly speaking, and the way China's posture on the world, and the way China sees itself as a player in the world, and the way Xi Jinping in particular has articulated this. This is something that had been getting more aggressive for some time, and that confrontation is just getting more and more to the fore. The problem is it's coming to the fore while we have in Washington a president who is acting in a very confusing way, quite frankly, where on the one hand, he's picking a very aggressive fight, and he's letting hawks within his administration really pick very nasty fights with the Chinese in general around the world, as well as sending off very mixed messages himself, all of which is painting a very confused sense of what it is that Washington really wants from China. But what China can read is that basically some parts of America are trying to pick a fight. So they're reacting to that. And during the COVID period, this has got distinctly worse. And we've seen the rhetoric coming out about accusations towards China getting much sharper. But then also, I think we've seen in Beijing a realization there was a moment that they might be able to try to take advantage of the situation, try to push some borders out. And I think that is what's really sort of kind of tipped the balance, in particular with parts of Europe, where, for example, what we've seen happening with Hong Kong in particular, some of the changes that we've seen in Xinjiang, even though they had been coming for some time, and even some of the stuff in the South China Sea or on some of China's other land borders with India or elsewhere, they do seem to be getting a lot worse suddenly now at a moment of China's choosing. And that, I think, is aggravating a lot of things in Europe, where I think Europeans are probably a bit ambivalent before COVID-19 about sort of seeing this China through a very aggressive American lens. They're probably more willing to give it a bit of a break. But since COVID-19 and China's reaction to that, that's really kind of stirred emotions up in Europe as well, meaning that you really have got a much more kind of transatlantic perspective now, really as a result of COVID and the sort of interplay, China's behavior subsequently, that has sharpened towards Beijing.
And so, Raffaello, obviously, we could, when we reflect on the question of China, right? So sometimes there's a tendency to use catchy phrases like Thucydides' trap. We're pretty much kind of trapped into this idea that there will be a contention between the world superpower and the emerging superpower. Or you often hear people making comments like, well, Russia is like a storm, but China is a climate change. So there's a bit of a mythification, if you like, of some of the Chinese capabilities, Chinese ambitions, Chinese reach. I mean, we've seen that a lot in discussions over Africa and Central Asia, to what extent Chinese activities in those continents have actually bore fruit beyond economic opportunities in terms of shaping the direction of things, or even competing with the interests of UK and its allies. What are some of the basic, if you like, ambitions of Chinese foreign policy? I mean, it's clearly aware that it's going to face a pushback from the US, from Europe, and from other actors that are not too thrilled with building of the islands in the South China Sea, popping up in places like in Serbia. We have seen, for example, Chinese police officers patrolling, I think, with Serbian officers. So some of these questions are coming very close now. A lot of theft of industrial information and scientific information. I mean, you've seen, I think, in US, the ban that brought against Chinese students pursuing graduate studies and advanced research in particular sensitive areas. But what is the right way of, or a nuanced way of, conceptualizing Chinese ambitions in the middle of it, beyond the soundbites on Thucydides' trap or China being a climate change, and the narratives that make it almost sound like in 10 years we'll be pretty much at war with China?
I mean, I think the way you started your point talking about some of these myth-making ideas of, Thucydides' trap or the kind of climate change question, China as climate change, Russia as a storm. I think these are narratives that the Chinese love, because basically they're all predicated on the fact that they're coming to be the big power on the block. And so this plays very much to something that they quite enjoy. So I think to some degree, these stories and narratives which come very much out of Western capitals are really just playing to kind of China's own sense of grandeur. And it does play to, I think, where China sees itself ultimately going to some degree. But what I think we have to understand is what is ultimately China's goals and ambition. And my perspective, China's ultimate ambition, we always have to remember, is driven by the Chinese Communist Party, which is ultimately a party that wants to maintain control of the country. It sees itself as the leader of this country, and it's going to take this country to a great leadership role in the next century. And so everything is geared towards essentially keeping them in power. And so all of their foreign policy decisions are made along these lines as well. And so this is where I think we need to separate things out a little bit. Because I think when you're looking at what China's doing in its near borders or on its immediate borders or in places like Taiwan, it doesn't necessarily see these things as foreign policy questions. It sees them as domestic policy questions that happen to touch into foreign policy areas. And if it's touching onto domestic policy questions, it's really talking about the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, saying, we are able to maintain control over this entire territory. And by just showing that we can do that, the people will let us continue to rule. Because their fear is that if they start to give way on some of these questions, the border ones particularly, or if they start to give away on Xinjiang, or they start to give away on Hong Kong, and parts of the country start to break away, then the country starts to fall apart. And then the public might start to ask, well, hang on, why are we leaving you in charge if you're not even able to keep our country together? And you have to remember that no matter how much we look at the Chinese Communist Party as this sort of behemoth of great terrifying grandeur, it's a party at its biggest is counted about 80 million people, right? Which is huge, bigger than most European countries. But within the context of China, of course, of 1.4 billion people, it isn't actually that large. And so there is that constant struggle. And I think that's the thing that we often forget, is that fundamentally, the CCP is about maintaining control and staying in power at home. That's their fundamental goal. And then so beyond that, when we look at sort of foreign policy, it's how does foreign policy help that at home? And so when we see China doing trade abroad, or when we see Chinese police going out, it's really again about showing that China is arriving on the world stage as a big power. Big powers have global projection. They do stuff around the world. This is part of it. This is why the PLA needs an aircraft carrier or two. This is why they need all these sort of big toys and tools, because ultimately this is demonstrative of the fact that they are, the world's second largest economy, on their way potentially to becoming the first. And so you kind of need a power that goes alongside that, because ultimately that will all feed back to this image of the CCP as the ruling party. Because, if you're the ruling party of the world's second largest economy and you can't project power, you don't have a global footprint, well, then what are you doing? Are you really the world's greatest power? And this whole narrative that we see coming out of home, which is of the great Chinese national rejuvenation, the whole idea of, 100 years of humiliation being overturned, about China being a great power on the world stage, starts to look a little shaky, a little questionable if you don't have this kind of global projection. So I think that's kind of the fundamental ambition when we think about it for the CCP, is really all about at home. And here, opinions will kind of differ, but there is a perspective out there that says that part of this is that the CCP is trying to sell its ideology around the world as well. I personally don't particularly buy that. I don't think they care that much if everyone else becomes a communist like them, or whatever their interpretation of communism is. I think if people are, great, they'll support it. But I think if they're not, they don't really care. Because if you look at various countries, they're willing, frankly, to work with whoever will ultimately work with them to advance their goal, which is basically about making the market more open to Chinese products and more access to their markets, and letting China do kind of what it wants there. And as long as it can, they kind of don't really care who's really in power. And this you can see across the board, where they're quite happy to work with, authoritarians, democracies, even non-state groups. I always think Egypt is an interesting case study of, in the Tahrir Square moment, the Arab Spring, the Chinese had a working relationship of great success with Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak gets defenestrated. Quite seamlessly, they developed a relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood government that comes in. They get defenestrated. Quite seamlessly, they develop a relationship with the Al-Sisi government, and contracts literally rolled over from one to the other. And Beijing was able to do this because basically, look, we don't really care who's in charge. You tell us who's in charge, and we'll just kind of do business with them. The ideological part doesn't necessarily appeal. I think the final point I'd add on this particular point, and it's one that I think we objectively need to stand back and think about a little bit sometimes, is when we look at some of the Chinese activity that's happening around the world, we should think about it from the lens of, well, what would you do if you were a big power that had major economic interests in country X or Y, that was unstable, that had a history of sort of, expropriating foreigners' assets? Wouldn't you maybe think about trying to deploy some soldiers there, or looking into how you could do this? In terms of the police that have been sent around the world, well, police exchange is not a new thing. There's lots of police who go around the world and do training missions and do stuff together. Why wouldn't the Chinese police explore doing that as well? They police big cities. They want to learn from the other experiences that others have done of doing this. So I think sometimes you have to step back and look a little bit at some of the activity they're doing, which may look sort of malign and very scary and whatever else, but in some ways you should ask the question, what would we do in a similar sort of situation? And it might not actually be that different. And that, I think, is quite helpful in terms of defanging some of the concerns that exist around some Chinese issues.
I think, Raf, that view has been quite prevalent in Europe and the UK as well. In other words, a recognition of the fact that you are talking about, one of the biggest economies in the world, one of the biggest populations in the world, with a lot to offer to the world as well. I mean, it's a permanent member at the UN Security Council. I think it's now the biggest contributor to peacekeeping missions. I think numerically now is China, if I'm not mistaken, from my memory. So just like you said, and it's active in Africa, it's increasingly pushing in Middle East. It has pushed a lot in Central Asia. Well, we need to basically work with them, and I think there's a lot of merit to that. Just accepting the reality of the China capabilities, positioning, etc. But then it's also important to note the actual areas of contention that some of these pushes create, right? So Hong Kong was, for example, one for us increasingly has become very sensitive, and we have seen how the UK government has taken a bold and public stand to even offer citizenship to Hong Kong residents and etc. What are some of the key areas of contention you foresee in this kind of nuanced appreciation of China's place in the world today, but also the complications of some of its activities and what that might mean from a European and American sensitivity perspective and contentions that it might create that actually we should pay attention to as UK?
I mean, I don't think we can underestimate the human rights question. And quite rightly so. I think the British government made a very bold and good decision, quite frankly, with the decision to give all British nationality document holders in Hong Kong, a pathway to nationality. I think that was it was the proper thing to do. It was, a pretty extreme card to play, but I think it was the right one. But I think the human rights question is going to become a problem, and it's a problem domestically within China with what we see happening in Xinjiang. It's a huge problem persistently politically within China as well. Political dissidents are not sort of top of the agenda at the moment, but they are regularly incarcerated within China. And we are seeing a real kind of dogma getting pushed down by, the central party, which is meaning that voices are finding themselves getting stifled and arrested. So that is negative, and we should be standing up for that. And I'm very pleased to see it when Western countries do. I think Taiwan is another one which needs to be paid careful attention to. I'm still, I never say never, but I'm still I'd be surprised if China was to resort to violence in terms of invading the island of Taiwan to take it back because of the optics of it domestically, because basically the CCP says this is not, they don't see it as a foreign country, they see it as part of their country. They see it as part of their cities. If they start bombing their own cities, that's quite a statement for them, and so I do question how far they're going to push that. But I think that Taiwan is still going to be a real problem because you are going to see stronger voices coming out of Taipei, and the West is rightly supporting them. And this is going to bring us into greater sort of potential confrontation. And how that confrontation expresses itself, I think, will become more complicated as time goes on. I think Hong Kong, I think the UK has done the right thing, but I think that hasn't resolved the question there. But I think it's kind of continued to put it forward. I think over the years, we're going to continue to see this bubbling up as an issue, which we're going to have to confront every so often. So I think the human rights side is something that has to be paid careful attention. It's going to continue to be an issue. I think externally, one of the big issues that is going to persistently come up is, it goes back to my point about how China's kind of willing to work with anyone, right? And on the one hand, that means they're willing to work with anyone, and they sort of end up having not a lot of problems on other places. But what it also means is that they end up supporting governments that, frankly, the West doesn't like and is actively maybe working to try to do something about, to try to help reform or democratize. And China's approach of just sort of no strings attached engagement does kind of undermine that. And that is going to be a problem persistently going forwards. I think if we're going to see, if the West sees another situation erupting like what we've seen happen in Libya, what we saw happening in Syria in the past, and an eagerness to try to intervene under UN auspices, I think it's going to be very difficult to get the Chinese to engage in that. And so it's going to start to really bring into question our ability to use these international institutions to get outcomes that we want and we see are important. I think China and our views on the world on some of these issues will increasingly clash and will block us really from doing stuff. And if you want to take action and you don't do it under UN auspices, you are doing a bilateral action, which of course raises all sorts of other political issues. So I think there's lots of problems to be raised in all of these areas. I think the other issue, which will slowly sort of play itself out over the medium to longer term, is, the degree to which China becomes a really kind of dominant, significant player in third world countries, right? Or other countries around the world. And what I mean by that is that if we look at the sort of pattern of investment and the pattern of activity that they've done in some parts of Africa, for example, some parts of South America, parts of Central Asia, parts of parts of Southeast Asia, you know, they are kind of becoming the dominant player in those places, right? And those places, some of them are pretty unstable, to be honest with you, or have governments that are really quite, you know, shaky. And so if we see some sort of a state collapse there, the question then becomes, what will Beijing do about this? And so far, we haven't really seen them do anything, to be honest. They've just kind of let it happen and just sort of stood back. And the question becomes, what happens when one of these situations where China is such a dominant player and kind of is the guy who owns all of the debt, let's say, is the one with the biggest economic interest, is the one with the biggest political interest, has lots of leadership figures in this country who've spent time in Chinese universities. You know, the whole kind of infrastructure is rewired to think of Beijing as a kind of important actor there. You know, what's going to happen if that place suddenly falls apart? Who's going to go in and try to fix it? And who's going to go in and try to do it? Now, previously, one would expect the West to step in, but then we're going to be stepping into a situation where you're going to have a very different kind of power as the kind of big boy on the block. And I think that is going to raise questions potentially going forwards in, as I say, the medium to longer term future. So, I mean, I think these are kind of the key points of contention you can see. The final one I'll touch upon very briefly, sorry, is the question of some of the global norms and standards that we're seeing being talked about. And, you know, I think on the one hand, we can look at all the global norms like the seas and space to some degree, and there's kind of a degree to which we basically are all competing within the space and have the same kind of toys. I think the one which is really challenging is the technology space, because the technology space, the whole infrastructure is still being built. You know, it's not like water, which just is there and was always there. We know where it is, right? Where the new pipelines of tech are going to be, where the new factories are going to be, where the new codes are going to come from, all of those things are still being developed and being created. And a growing number of those are being created in China with technology that frankly is pretty cheap and pretty good. And that's going to be very appealing. And so you're going to start to get, and there's a real danger of this already, that you're going to really get this bifurcation where you have kind of two worlds, two tech worlds, a kind of tech world that's made up of China linked goods and a tech world that's linked of American or Western linked goods. And the truth is, I suspect it won't stop there. I suspect it'll, you know, will fragment even more than that. And that will really fundamentally challenge some of the underlying ideas and, you know, utilities that frankly tech, you know, cyber tech in particular has had for us all until now.
And Raf, I think that kind of already points towards my other question, which is, okay, clearly there is U.S. concern, you know, the Trump administration, but even beyond Trump administration, I mean, you know, this is a kind of non-partisan issue for in D.C. and within U.S. defense and security thinking as well as foreign policy. But there's been a push to get Europeans and the UK to think like the US. And Huawei was a very tangible kind of example of that, right? So you had a 5G technology, which the US legitimately raised concerns about security implications of it. But even when Europeans were exploring, and in the UK too, about whether this could be contained, I mean, there was a huge diplomatic pressure, right, for the UK and others to basically back down from some of these engagements with China, etc. You even heard the threats of sanctions being implied here and there. So as you have two kind of major superpowers kind of digging their heels in this Manichaean narrative of the world, you know, bipolarity, they both seem to enjoy, like this arch enemy that is in competition. What does that mean for countries like the UK, which obviously will always be, and rightfully and understandably, closer to our allies in the US and in Europe, because of our historical ties, because of the way we see the world and the values we aspire to, sometimes not necessarily achieving, but we aspire to, and in human rights and democracy, and even principles of how we position ourselves. But this is going to mean a lot, and it has already signals that in countries like the UK. I mean, I heard this within some of the NATO circles, you know, some even people saying, should NATO focus more on China as a way of getting Americans more interested in some of these, again, continental European security issues or even Middle East concerns? I mean, is it going to be a implied, direct, or willing kind of internalization of China as a threat that we want to signal because Americans are focusing on it? Or are we going to be able to, as medium powers, find another route out of it? Or is that even possible?
I mean, I think you're pointing a whole thicket of very complicated questions there. I would very briefly pick up on a point which I think you made incidentally, but I think it's an interesting thing that people forget is if you talk about NATO and NATO engaging more on China, and this is something that I've heard talked about a lot as well. The one point I'll make about that is that NATO's active engagement on the world stage in Afghanistan is happening on China's border. And actually, it's a situation where, to be honest with you, China engaging more would probably be to NATO's benefit, to be honest with you, because then it would help stabilize the country a little bit more, and then NATO could finally get out of this seeming never-ending operation. There are all sorts of problems attached to that, but I think it's something that people often forget, is that we get so focused on thinking of the world through what Washington determines, which is China is the adversary, that's the end of that, wherever this happens, you have to confront them, that we forget that there are some places and some issues where, to be honest, if we don't engage with China, it's just not going to work. You know what I mean? So I think Afghanistan is an example of this. You know, China needs to play a role there. It's on the border. It's the biggest economic player in Afghanistan's backyard. And, you know, frankly, more China would be a positive thing in that particular context. They haven't really done a huge amount yet. But if you think of other issues like climate change, you know, if you're going to get the world to deal with the issues of climate change, and you're not going to deal with China, which is the world's largest emitter, I mean, you might as well not bother, to be honest, you know, because everything else is irrelevant, you know. So I think it's important to think about these issues in that sort of round. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we don't confront China on issues. And I think this is where, in some ways, the American approach of a very rigid view of confrontation across the board is probably not helpful, because I think that there are issues that we should be confronting China about, and I think we do. Human rights is one, and, you know, Hong Kong and Taiwan and Xinjiang are all issues that we should certainly be confronting China about, and certainly raising as issues that we are gravely concerned about and we would like to see China take different behavior about. But we have to separate those from other issues where, to be honest, China is going to be a partner or is going to be a power we're going to have to engage with. And I think that is very much the view that you see coming out of London, a lot of European capitals. Now, over the past year, because of what we've seen in terms of COVID, and also because, frankly speaking, China has not lived up to promises that it's made in the past. So if you look at sort of market access, for example, you know, the European Union has had repeated discussions with China about European companies being given greater access to the Chinese market in some specific areas. And Chinese say, yes, it's going to happen. It never happens. You know, reform and state it just doesn't happen. You know what I mean? They keep talking about it, but it never actually sort of comes to fruition. And so there's a question about that. I think frustration comes on top of some of these other issues that we've seen, the kind of the irritation that I think people have felt as a result of COVID and China's reaction to it, the anger around some of the human rights issues and some of the border disputes that we've seen with India. And all of this means that you are seeing a willingness in Europe and the UK in particular to take a much more kind of hawkish American perspective. But I think there is a limit to how far they want that to go. And I think there's a general hope that after the election at the end of this year in Washington, we will be able to somehow have some sort of reset or recalibration in the relationship with China that continues to confront China on certain key issues and push them on issues of concern and issues where we want change and movement, but also recognize that engagement is necessary in some other context. And I think the question is whether Washington's perspective will be more willing to embrace that or not. I would suspect if we have a Biden administration, they would be more willing to embrace that, because notwithstanding this constant narrative we hear of it being a bipartisan issue, this hostility towards China in Washington, I think there is some variance in there as well. You know, I think there is some variance. The question really becomes how much damage is done before then. You know, and this is where I think the real concern lies at the moment, is that if we see issues like the student ban, we see some of the more strident measures that we see being pushed out of Washington actually be pulled through, it's going to set the relationship in such a negative place. It's going to be very difficult to reset it back. And certainly the Chinese are probably not going to give up any of the territory they've gained during this period. So any land that they've claimed with the Indians, any of these islands they've reclaimed now, what they've changed in the law in Hong Kong, what they're doing in Xinjiang, they're not going to back down on any of this because they can't, because this is something they've done for their perspective domestically. So if they were to back down on it, they would be backing down in response to foreign pressure, which then means they're weak, which then means that the public would start to question whether they should really be in charge. So they can't back down on any of that. So that's not going to happen. The question is, how far have we pushed the boat? Or how far has the United States pushed the boat in terms of its policies? And is there kind of a point of no return that we end up getting to? So, you know, I think in London, there is a desire to try to find a way through the middle. And to be honest, with most powers around the world, there's a desire to try to find a way through the middle. Even countries like India, which seem to be locked in a very aggressive position. You know, they ultimately, the Indians realize that they sit on the border with China. they realize that this is an economy which is giant and is an important investor potentially to them, and is an important player in their backyard. And so they need to have some sort of, so even they, you can see, are trying to find a way of trying to thread that needle, even though the sort of the bar is now been shifted to a very kind of low place. So I think it's a question of how do you thread the needle between the two, and really where it is that we get to in terms of how far things have been pushed in the current administration in Washington. And so therefore, how far can we sort of walk it back afterwards?
Raffaello, thank you so much. I mean, this has been a very rich conversation, and as you rightfully observed, the questions themselves are really complex, because the question is really complex itself. I mean, and your answers have highlighted that the difficulty of coming up with a nuanced and constructive approach to issues raising with Chinese presence in some of these arenas, yet at the same time also drawing a line and boundary on question of human rights in some of their territorial ambitions, and an incarceration of more than 1 million people in Xinjiang, for example, which the things that we vowed to never allow it happen again seems to be happening. So thank you so much for your time and insights, and thanks to everybody who listened and who watched this. If you want to watch more of these videos, you can visit us at www.chacer.org.uk. Thank you.